right, we're going to talk about sex-linked inheritance. Now, sex-linked inheritance is just like any genetic cross. However, it is going to determine the sex of an offspring. Now, when we talked about sex chromosomes are going to be X and Y. So, if you are a female, you have two X chromosomes. And if you're an XY, your sex chromosomes makes you a male. Now, when we talk about sex-linked inheritance, some inheritance comes from these chromosomes. All right, so when talking about sex-linked inheritance, the most important chromosome is the X chromosome. So your X chromosome is actually the one that's responsible for carrying traits or genetic traits on the X chromosome. The X chromosome is where it's at. So many of these traits are on the X chromosome, not the Y chromosome. All right, so when we talk about how you can decide if you're going to get a male or female, you could do a Punnett square. Obviously, a mom is going to be crossed with a dad. To determine if you're going to have a male or female, you would do a normal cross with your sex chromosomes, like in a Punnett square. XX and XY. So honestly, when determining the sex of an offspring, you have a 50-50 chance of getting a male, which is XY, versus a female. Now, a lot of students tell me, well, then why are there so many females? There's a lot of talk about sex chromosomes, and they say that the Y chromosome is weak, and sometimes it makes you have spontaneous abortions, but there is just a lot of information that we don't really know about the Y chromosome, but we do know that sometimes the Y chromosome is a little bit weaker, and that's why they believe that there are more females than males. Now, when we talk about traits on the X chromosome, a lot of times if you have these traits, you carry a recessive, basically a chromosome on the X chromosome. So when we talk about sex-linked inheritance, a lot of diseases or genetic disorders come from the sex-linked recessive trait. This would be color blindness. If you're colorblind, you have to have the recessive alleles on your X chromosomes. So this is a recessive trait. It is sex-linked. So anytime you see the word sex-linked, you have to use XX and XY. Also, another one, a bleeding disorder, hemophilia, is also a recessive trait that's a sex-linked inheritance pattern. So when we talk about color blindness, you have to think about the terms homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and homozygous recessive. So if we are a female, you can actually represent 3 different ways, or present 3 different ways. So when we talk about color blindness, you can use this in terms of big R, little r, or big N, little n. But the first thing is when you talk about a female who is not colorblind, let's just say N is for normal vision, a big N. You can be a non-carrier for colorblindness. So this would be a female because it is XX. However, she is non-colorblind because she does not have any recessive traits. So this is like simple dominance with sex-linked inheritance. So she is not colorblind at all because she has 2 normal traits. Now, you can be a female who is a carrier for colorblindness. Now, if you're a carrier, we know that the phenotype is female because it is XX. However, because she has 1 recessive trait on her X chromosome, she is considered to be a carrier for colorblindness. Now, she is normal. However, she is a carrier for colorblindness. She is considered to be heterozygote in that she has a big N and a little n. And again, this is sex-linked inheritance, and sex-linked inheritance come on the X chromosomes. Now, if you're a colorblind female, that is pretty rare. If you're colorblind, you have to have 2 recessive traits on your X chromosomes. So you have to have both sex chromosomes X with recessive traits. So again, this is a female. That is her phenotype because it's XX sex-linked chromosomes. But because she has 2 recessive traits on the sex chromosome, she would be a colorblind female. So we're talking about 2 things now in terms of phenotypes. The male or female, which you look at XX and XY. And then the next thing is, are they colorblind or not? Well, the only way you can be colorblind is if you have, for a female, 2 recessive alleles. Now, males are different. For males, we're only looking at the X. So, males can only have a chromosome on their X. So, this is kind of bad for males because they're either colorblind or they're not. Males, this would be non-colorblind. He's not a carrier because you only have 1 X. And then you have a male who is colorblind. Now, this is a recessive trait, but because males do not carry 2 X's, you only look at the 1 X and you say they're either colorblind or not. This one is a colorblind male. So most sex-linked inheritance things that we receive are going to be recessive patterns. Now, when you do a sex-linked inheritance cross, you have to read it very carefully. Is it a female who is not colorblind? Is it a female who's a carrier? So if you're not colorblind, you're considered to be homozygous dominant for not colorblindness. If you're a carrier, that means you're heterozygous. And if you're colorblind, that would mean you're homozygous recessive. But again, you always have to include your X's and your Y's because this is sex-linked inheritance. So we're going to do a practice cross. Now, in a test question, you might see that I have a normal. Normal means non-colorblind male. So if we know he is non-colorblind, he does not have that recessive trait, and he mates with a colorblind female. So this is how you would figure it out. A colorblind female, again, colorblindness is recessive. So to figure this out, you would basically have to know what you're writing on your sex-linked inheritance. So you could draw out a Punnett square, just like you would with any other cross. And if you have a normal, non-colorblind male, you know that a male is XY. And we know that female is XX. So you have to use, this is sex-linked inheritance, so you always have to write your sex-linked chromosomes. Otherwise, you'll get it wrong. So when you say non-colorblind male, you would put a big N or a big R, whatever letters you're using. But if you have a colorblind female, we know that this is a sex-linked recessive trait. So if you have a colorblind female, then she has to be 2 little n's. So this would be the cross that you would do. Now you divide these just like you would in any Punnett square. So you put the female to the side, you divide her sex chromosomes, but now you're also going to include the trait for colorblindness. The male is non-colorblind, so he has a dominant trait here. So you do your cross. You always put your large alleles in front. You always put the X in front of the Y. And when we look at this and we talk about the genotypes and phenotypes of this cross, like what would their offspring be, their genotypes, you're going to list them inside of here. So you have a female who is going to be heterozygous. You have one female that is also two heterozygous, so you can literally just write here, 2. You have a male that is going to be colorblind. He is recessive, and we have 2 of those. So you would say you have 2 of each of those. They match, so you don't need to write any other ones. Now, your phenotypes. Phenotypes are going to include both male and female, and are they colorblind or a carrier or just normal. So these are 2 females. So you're going to have females that are normal. So normal means non-colorblind, but they are going to be a carrier for colorblindness. And since you have 2 of those, these would be your phenotypes. They're normal, but because they are heterozygous, they're considered to be a carrier. These are not colorblind. They are a carrier for colorblindness, but they are not colorblind. Now your male, on the other hand, you're going to end up with 2 males. These are going to be colorblind because they have the recessive trait. So you would say 2. Now, if you were doing these crosses for hemophilia, hemophilia is also a recessive trait. Instead of using the letter N's, you would say, I'm going to use the lowercase h for recessive. So you could have a normal female that is not hemophilia, so you would change those to capital H's opposed to N's. Hemophilia, I'm just using H for hemophilia. You could technically use R for colorblindness because colorblindness is mostly for red colorblindness. So a lot of times they'll use the letter R for red-green colorblindness. And it is more common for males to become colorblind because they only have one X chromosome. And that's kind of an important aspect to understand about sex-linked inheritance.